Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming today. So in thinking about this year's series topic, knowledge under fire, and what that means in our settings, it's hard not to think about all the changes that have been happening at the federal level and what that means for public education at the local level. And that's something that we're thinking a lot about at HERC because of the work that we do with school districts in the Houston region. Because I have you as a captive audience, I'm going to tell you a little bit about HERC and more about what we do, because that's going to take us to my messaging at the end around some of the challenges I'm going to offer to the folks sitting in this room and the folks who have a chance to listen later on. So HERC, or the Houston Education Research Consortium, we are one of the 5 research centers that makes up the Kinder Institute for Urban Research here at Rice University. So we're the education research group at the Kinder Institute. We're what's considered a research practice partnership. And so what that means to us is all of the research that we do is in direct partnership with school districts in the Houston region. So these 8 districts up here, these are the folks that we work with. We want to make sure that the research we do gets used. And so that means we have to involve school districts in designing those questions and the projects that we're doing from the get-go. Otherwise, we're doing research on school districts and not with school districts. And all of this is with the goal of informing decisions they're making to improve outcomes and opportunities for students in the Houston region. We can't have a conversation around what changes are happening to public education without starting with thinking about what is the purpose of public education in the first place. Today, the way that folks typically talk about the purpose of public education, and I'll see what reaction you all in the room have to this sentiment, is that the purpose of education is to create a well-informed and well-developed workforce to contribute to the US economy. Nodding, some nodding. And I feel like this is a sentiment around education that folks on both sides of the political aisle tend to say, okay, yeah, I can agree with the sentiments of that. But when we think back to the start of public education, the modern public education system in the US, it was really about the idea of how are we developing informed citizens who are contributing to our community, and how are we preparing those folks for work. And so the person that we think of as sort of the father of this modern public education movement, Horace Mann, he argued that it's important for us to have an informed society, that we provide education free of charge, that folks, regardless of background, should have access to it. So no matter your religious or social or ethnic status, you should have access to public education, that we should be doing it with the concept of a free society in mind, and that teachers should be the people who are informing what that looks like. But as I mentioned, the way that we're thinking about public education is shifting a little bit. So it's not only about how are we preparing people to be citizens, but how are we preparing them for what life is like now. So in 2016, there was a survey that went out nationally asking people, what do you think should be the main goal of public education? And these were the options that were offered to folks. So is it to prepare students to be good citizens, to prepare students academically, or to prepare them for work? And so this is the rough breakdown of we're gonna ignore the gray slot. This is the rough breakdown of those 3 categories. So what do you think makes up that 45%? To the folks in the room, which of those options on the left side do you think is the 45? Work. Holler it out. Work? Good citizen. A quarter of respondents said work. 45% said it should be to prepare students academically, and another quarter said it should be about preparing good citizens. Who responded to this survey? Nationally. This is a national survey, Chad. And so, but this 45% in this shift, again, 2016, so not that recent, but I happen to know somebody in the room who maybe could ask a question like this of the Houston community as we move forward, some of the Kinder survey teams in the room. But this 45% shift reflects what I'm talking about around the changing perspectives on the purpose of education. So it's no longer this half of the group and what they're thinking about and how education is serving people individually, but really this academic mindset and how we're thinking about what it means to shift people to be good, well-trained workers so we can be competitive in the US economy can thrive. So we talked about the purpose of education, but who's responsible for it? I don't think we have any poli-sci people in the room, so hopefully no one yells at me too much for this, but because I'm going to oversimplify this. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution basically says that anything that we don't call out in the Constitution as being responsible federal responsibility is the state responsibility. And so that's where education falls, right? So since the start of the US political system, the responsibility of education has been to the states. And so thinking back to the 1600s, when we were first starting to do something related to education, it was more about we're teaching kids to read because we want them to be able to read the Bible. We want them to be able to get religious teachings, and primarily Protestant religious teachings, and that was how we used education. And as we move into the 17 and 1800s, there were shifting perspectives on we should be providing this education free of cost. The people who can afford it will pay for it, but poor kids, we should make sure they have access to free education. But this is going to sound a lot like things we might have heard in more recent years. There was a lot of pushback, but people said, I don't want my taxes going towards public education. That's not what it should be for. So it wasn't just about whether education existed and who had access to it, but we know back then that very few people had access to the public education system. In the southern states, there were often laws around who could learn to read, or laws against teaching slaves to read in particular. And who kept having access to public education is still a conversation we're having today. You know, we can think about this as what were the laws and policies in place in the 1800s, but we're having similar conversations about access today. Increasingly, control shifted from states to local settings with the influx of Irish immigrants that happened in the middle of the 19th century. So after the Great Famine, a lot of immigrants came into New York from Ireland, and they were Catholic families, and they didn't want their kids getting Protestant educations. And so they made a much higher push for more local control of public education and what that would mean. This shift to more local control and smaller education at local levels ended up with us having 200,000 school districts by the early 1900s in the US. But most of those 200,000 school districts were one-room schoolhouses. But because of changes that happened throughout the 1900s, which feels funny to say 1900s when I'm about to reference 1970, is that those one-room schoolhouses consolidated. They could no longer be filled with students because there were changes happening, right? Urbanization was happening, agriculture was changing, it was becoming more mechanized, so people weren't having to spend as much time on farms. There were decreasing birth rates, and so infrastructure was changing. People had access to transportation, so a schoolhouse didn't have to be something they could walk to. Transportation could get them to schoolhouses in other places, and so then by the 70s, we had 20,000 school districts across the country instead of 200,000. But as we move, so when we think about education, right, it falls in this federal, state, and local control, and really push more to state and local control. But in the 1960s, the federal government started stepping into public education a little bit more than it had in the past. And that was largely through policies that they were putting into place to protect opportunities for students. So in 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And what that did was offer resources to state and local school districts so they can provide high quality education to students. It protected students of different demographic groups in terms of having access to education, and also had a goal of providing more support to ensure success in school for students. And so those types of policies that were part of that Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we're thinking about things like, how are we providing more resources to schools who are serving large populations of economically disadvantaged or low-income students? How are we providing more support to get teachers trained? How are we providing more support to those school districts who are trying to teach students English, or have our students who are living in migrant families who are moving around? How do we protect and make sure that they have access to resources? And so all of that came through the policies that started in the 60s. And over the last 60 years since then, every 5 to 10 years, some version of that act gets reauthorized. So the more recent versions of it that you've heard, and it all connects back to that 1965 Act, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, Every Student Succeeds. But what we've seen in most recent year in recent months is kind of an attack on public education, an attack on the role that the federal government plays in education, and arguments to try to eliminate that federal role, back it off so that it's going back to state control. Some of the arguments around federal control of and the policies that were getting taken up by the Department of Education is that the Department of Education, the resources they are using don't go to students. One of the estimates that was made was that only 25% of the budget of the Department of Education is making it to directly serve students. The other 75% is for bureaucracy, it's for overhead, it's waste. Does anyone know what percent of Department of Education spending actually goes to students? Around 90%. With around 70% of that being through direct programs like grants and scholarships for higher education. That's the biggest chunk of what the Department of Education budget is spent on. And then another 25% of it goes to states and tribes to be administering education. So that's a lot of resources that are through the Department of Education that are connected to all those programs I mentioned that are at risk of going away, and resources that are at risk of going away. So some of the things that are happening through some of the executive orders coming through, the elimination of the Department of Education, are leading to, or could be leading to, cuts in programs serving migrant children, children who are emergent bilingual or learning English, students who are currently unhoused, other at-risk student populations, special education students. Resources are at risk of going away. And what that looks like in Houston is this. Everybody loves a map, right? So there's a map, that's Houston. Find your congressional district on the map. And so what this is showing you is how cuts that are in the current budget, right? So the federal government right now is in the process of trying to decide on the budget for FY26. In the president's budget, this is what cuts would look like by congressional district in the Houston region. Cuts to education by cutting funds from those programs I'm talking about. Programs for English learners, programs for migrant students, programs for at-risk students, programs for students in poverty. In the Houston region, around 1/3 of students are emergent bilingual or English learner students. So these are huge cuts that are happening for a big proportion of students that are in our community. And what's gonna happen is that states are gonna have to fill in some of those gaps because they're still gonna have to provide those programs and supports and services to students, but they're not getting the federal support to do that. One of the arguments that is getting made right now is that the Department of Education is gonna take the funds that were for all of those programs I mentioned, they're gonna put them into a block grant and give that to states. And so states can have this flexible funding that they administer how they need to, depending on what groups they're trying to serve or what programs they want to have in place. But what's coming along with that block grant opportunity, if the money actually makes it to states, is a 60% cut to those programs. So we're putting them all together, and then we're gonna cut 60% off the top and tell the states, here, now you figure it out, instead of the resources going directly to school districts and campuses. What it means for education research, and so this is a topic that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts, is that there have been major cuts to the education research infrastructure in the Department of Education as well. Less than 2% of the overall Department of Education budget goes to research. And this is another pool of funds that's at risk by being cut, about 2/3 for next year. So there are a lot of grants that have already been in place around research, education research programs that are either frozen or have been cut entirely, or they haven't opened new programs for next year either. But the purposes of education as it relates to the federal government was that in 2002, George W. Bush put into place an Education Sciences Act, which started the Institute for Education Sciences, and that was a way to collect information about students, to understand how they're doing across the country, to have students to know how different states are doing compared to each other. But then a big part of the resources were also about figuring out what works. How can we use research to figure out what works for educating students and provide those teaching resources to educators across the country? And so all of those programs are at significant risk. They've either been cut or are at risk of being cut as we move forward. Some of the arguments that others are making is, look, if we have cuts to those programs, it's fine. We can use philanthropy to fill in. But the amount of support that research organizations like us or individual researchers would need to fill those gaps, that's not something that local or national philanthropic organizations can meet. We really need resources and investment from like the federal level to make those changes and improve opportunities and outcomes for students. So we're talking a lot about federal, and let's start thinking about how some of these federal changes, I talked about money as a whole, but some of these other federal changes are coming through to have implications at our more local level. So in January, this is one of the executive orders that was passed. In a nutshell, this is a vouchers or school choice executive order. So the argument behind or within this is that the president was asking the Secretary of Education to find discretionary resources in K-12 education that could get pushed through to states to open up vouchers for students and for families. They were asking the Secretary of Education to pull funds from the Child Care and Development Block Grant Program. So that program, Child Care Development Block Grant, that is what offers vouchers and subsidies to families who can't afford really expensive childcare so that they can work. And so can we find some cuts from that program? They asked the DoD, the Department of Defense, to find cuts in the Department of Defense so that military families could have access to school choice. And when I said that is coming down to Texas, if you see the third bullet I have on the list, so these are the bills that passed in the most recent legislative session in Texas. We can talk about them all later, but I'm going to focus on one for today, and that's talking about vouchers. So for those of you who don't know, starting in the fall of 26, families are going to have access to financial resources provided by the state to send their children to private schools. So what that looks like is $10,000 per family if you want to send your student to private school, and for families who have students with extra learning needs, you can get up to $30,000, and for homeschool families, that's $2,000. Despite being largely supported by conservatives, this idea of vouchers or school choice, in the state of Texas, there was a lot of pushback for vouchers from rural areas, conservative legislators in rural areas, for two big reasons. One, they're already hurting for resources, and they knew the cuts that would come to their budgets, even if their kids weren't leaving their schools, were going to be detrimental to the services and resources they could provide. But then also, in rural areas, there aren't a lot of other options, so their students aren't going to have access to these vouchers anyway. Some of the arguments for vouchers, or why we should have them, is that there's an argument that gets made that public education isn't serving our students, that families should have choice, they should be able to pick where they want to send their kids, and there's a free market argument that if we have vouchers, public schools are going to get better because they have to compete. If they want to keep kids, they're definitely going to get better. The arguments against vouchers are that private schools don't have to support students with special needs, and so that's a population that doesn't have access to private schools as a resource. And then there's no accountability, this is in the state of Texas, for private schools or homeschooled students. Whether or not you agree with the current Texas state accountability system or the standardized test that they take, which is called STAR here in Texas, that's something that exists that people can use as a reference point to understand how students are doing over time, how districts are doing over time, and for them to keep track of how things are going. But there's not a standardized test that private school students are taking, and they're not part of the state accountability system. And so they would be getting access to resources, but with little oversight in terms of how things are going and whether it's meeting the ultimate goals of giving students access to more success down the road. A few years ago, Arizona passed vouchers, and so they budgeted, or they figured out that it was going to cost about $65 million to provide vouchers in Arizona. It actually ended up costing $700 million for vouchers. As a result of that, they had to cut infrastructure programs, like water infrastructure programs that they were about to start. And in a state that faces significant droughts, that's a big deal. They cut funding, scholarship programs for low-income students for college in the state of Arizona. And the reason why they were so over budget, there are two main reasons. One is that most of the people who took advantage of vouchers were already in private schools or homeschooling. So you weren't shifting kids out of the public school system into these other settings, they were already in those other settings. So schools, campuses were getting about $300,000 less per campus, but still serving 90% of students in the state of Arizona. And then the other reason was that the amount that they were giving for vouchers was more than the cost to educate a student in public school. So for all of these reasons, they were way over budget, and the estimate for this year is over $800 million. So that's way far from the $65 million that they estimated. So what are the things we can do? The top two ones are the easy ones for me to tell you. To be informed, ask questions of your legislators, not just your state legislators, but your federal, national folks as well, and vote. But the bigger thing that I'm gonna spend the rest of my time today, the next 2 minutes talking about, is challenging you to fill the gaps. And when I'm talking about filling the gaps, I'm not talking about financially, because none of us are gonna make up the $600 million that the Houston area is at risk of losing as it relates to public education. But it's about using the resources that we have available to us. We're at Rice. Many of you are probably highly trained researchers, and you have a way to use those tools to support our community that maybe in a way that you haven't done before. So I hope President DeRoche doesn't mind, but I borrowed a picture from the momentous strategic plan. If you haven't seen this, this is Rice's strategic plan. And one of the things that I want to focus on is on this research side. And in particular, the first pillar in there, which is building thriving urban communities. Within the strategic plan, it says to build thriving urban communities by leading collaborative research and scholarship and social, economic, and systemic barriers. But when we're talking about collaborative research, and this is the way that I'm gonna challenge the room to think about it, this isn't about me finding a colleague in another department who thinks my idea is cool and we're gonna work together and collaborate on this project. What collaborative means in this setting is how are we working with community organizations? In our case, it's school districts, but there are lots of other ways you could be doing this. And doing research with them, not on them. Having them involved in the questions we're asking, not using extractive research processes and treating those organizations like data sets because we want to advance our career, but how can we use our research and skills and tools that we have here at Rice to provide information that they need to be making decisions? As it relates to that top one, the communication one, something I tell the team at HERC all the time, if you never say the phrase statistically significant when you talk to one of our school district partners, that's okay. Because the challenge to us is to talk about research in a different way, right? You can still do all the rigorous research, but know how to communicate it to the people who can use it. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share a little bit of my research and outreach to the wider community at the Rice University. So today, my talk is about this topic, interpretability of decision trees in the AI area, where AI means artificial intelligence and era is our era. So my talk is going to split into basically 4 parts. The first part, we're going to explain very briefly what I mean by interpretability in our community and also in a wider community. And the second part is our main dish of the day. We'll introduce the tree-based models to all of you. I hope that's a joyful model to learn. And then the third, after we learn these tree models, we're going to play some games to how to see it, to see how these tree-based models can actually help us to establish the interpretability in our research. And in the end, we're wrapping up with a summary. So let's start. So interpretability is a key research direction in the stats and also the machine learning community that we are trying to actually interpret the model we fit. We all have our own models. Some are useful, some are not that useful. And nowadays, we have even more advanced models like the large language models our students probably use every day. And then also have the diffusion models, which generate nice artistic figures that really pleasures us. So all of these models were actually can give us very nice results, either prediction, estimation, or beyond. However, the focus of the interpretability research is actually to understand our model, just like we understand our friends, our collaborator, we also need to understand how our model works. So technically, people will just focus on these 3 different components of interpretability. The first one is the simulatability. That means that if we have this model, we can generate the predictions ourselves given the model. So as long, for example, if we actually draw a line to predict the trend, we got that line fitted, and then we pick a new point, we can draw our own prediction, that simulatability. And there's also another meaning of this simulatability. That means that we can generate new samples from our fitted model. That's another layer of simulatability. That means we can, by simulation, actually draw more new samples. So the second one is relatively straightforward. That's the decomposability. That means if you under each part of the model, then like the slope of the trend, like the intercept of the trend, you can understanding the overall model. Understanding the whole thing, we need to understand each component of this thing, right? The third one is algorithmic transparency. This is a little bit more modern thing. That means that, well, most of the model does not admit a very simple fit. So usually people will actually come up with a very smart algorithm to like fit such a very complicated model, like the large language model, diffusion model that generate image. All those things were fitted by kind of like a black box algorithms. However, the algorithm needs to be reproducible as well as understandable. So this is the first level of the transparency that consists of the interpretability that we're going to talk about today. So after this basic introduction to interpretability, I want to advertise this very nice, simple model to you. That is the tree model. So Statistics 101, each of us have learned the histogram, right? It's a bar, equally spaced bins, higher, lower. So the trees can actually be treated as a more flexible data-driven histogram, okay? What does that mean? That means you can have a little bit fatter bins. The bins could move around, even overlapping. So that will give us a more flexible description of our data. And that itself gives us a more flexible model to learn and play with. So this is the expression, the mathematical expression of this model. And just like the histogram, each of the bin has a little support that partitions the space into different small squares, let's say. The tree will also give us such a partition of the space that allows us to learn a little bit piece of the space once at a time. It gives us such a partition of the data that allows us to learn the locality of the data, but also, well, when we aggregate all those bins together, we have an overall sense of what the data looks like globally. So here is a concrete example of the trees. And it's very straightforward here that if we turn it upside down, it really looks like a small tree, right? So this kind of a tree structure is everywhere in computer science, data science, and also social science when people need to make a decision, right? Even in the medical school, like they actually use such a decision tree structure to actually describe their flow chart of the diagnostic procedures. So this is one of the ways that we kind of blend the interpretability into such a tree representation. So these 3 kinds of tree we show here actually evidence my description that the tree can also be considered as a histogram. So if we draw a vertical line here, 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 here. So this becomes a little bends. But the bin does not have to be equal size. We can actually also have different location of the centers of bins, right? When we have the perfectly binary tree here, then we reduce to our favorite histogram, right? So this is the one-dimensional case. And then if in a 2-dimensional case, once again, we can describe this as a 2-dimensional histogram, right? As 2-dimensional bar charts, different heights, different sides. And when we trace along these decision trees, we can actually also recover the decision rules, okay? So this actually consists of the second layer of the interpretability, right? We can actually trace down the decision tree to actually form our decision rule. By tracing down the tree, following the path, we actually arrive at a partition. And within this partition, we can draw our own decision as well as the prediction. So this is how the model works in the general space in RD. So now we map back to the interpretability, okay? We mentioned about this as simulatability, decomposability, and algorithmic transparency, right? So after we introduce our tree models, we can actually trace down the path in the trees so that once we got the fitted tree, we can generate the prediction ourselves, right? It's just like a simple flow chart. We got a new data with our brain. We can actually trace down the tree path and then reach a decision. This satisfies the simulatability. And for the decomposability, when we trace down the path of the tree, at each node, we actually make a sequential decision. Each small decision we make satisfies some criterion, right? So this whole process of actually tracing down this decision tree will actually ask us to understand each node decision. So each node decision we understand actually meets this second criterion of this decomposability. So the third one is the algorithmic transparency. So we want to actually make the tree finitely depth so that with finitely many decisions, we can reach our final decisions, okay? It converges to the single solution as long as the tree is fitted. There's a finitely many leaves, and then there are finitely many decisions. So this is just a check saying that the tree models that we just introduced satisfy all this interpretability criterion. And therefore, it's actually a model that can be interpreted by a human, okay? So here is also like a formal comment that Frosser and Hinton wrote back in 2017. They actually argue that a very black box model, for example, like large language model, can actually be distillated through a soft decision tree. So that's our dream, that if we actually have a large language model like ChatGPT, can we use simple models that were interpretable like this decision tree to sequentially approximate it? Okay, that might be hard, but we're going to have a short taste of the 3 different ongoing research in this direction of the tree-based model. The first direction of the research, we try to answer this question, like how shall we decide the split? So for the tree, we actually have the decision rules along each node. And yes or no actually consists of the split in right or left path. So how do we actually decide the split? Like if we look back to here is actually, the split are actually depending on the actual value of the input, like x1 and x2, right? So when you had the input, you actually decided whether you're going to left or right, or you're going to this partition or that partition based on your input values. That split could be learned from the data. But here, we move one step forward, saying that the split can not only depend on data, but also depends on engineered features. So it could be a symbolic expression of the input or some engineered pre-selected feature of the data. The principle here is that we choose a split into left and right children node to make the sum of the children's variance to be as small as possible. So we divided our audience into 2 groups, and then we want to make the in-group variance as small as possible. So these 2 groups were clustered together. We're family, so we are clustering more together. This is the idea behind this, making the sum of the children's variance as small as possible. And then the frequency of these features x elected by the splits induced a very flexible partition, as we just saw in the previous 2 images. according to their suitability. So by using this, idea, we can also learn some symbolic regression through the decision tree split. For example, when Newton looked at the apple falling down the tree, right? It collects data, the speed and the height of the apple. Instead of fitting a 128-layer neural network, Newton come up with Newton's law, which is a symbolic regression, right? So here is what we're trying to do here automatically using the decision tree. So instead of trying to fit the data as best as we can, we actually prefer such a simpler, transparent, interpretable model that can engineer such a symbolic regression that roughly describe the data, but also reveal the intrinsic nature of the problem. That's the benefit of actually using such an interpretable model. Back in 18th century, if Newton were using neural network, he had to wait 200 years more to have the computer to fit it. Then it will be Hinton's law instead of Newton's law, right? So this is the first thing we want to advocate today, that we want an interpretable model that could be a symbolic regression, and symbolic feature itself could actually be traced down by a decision tree, okay? And that is because we can actually put the operators as well as the expression among each of the nodes to actually consist of this kind of a composition of the symbolic expression, okay? The technical detail is in our paper, but I won't go too deep into it, but move on to the second application. So just like I said, the diffusion model handles images, but can tree also handles images or other modalities of the data? The answer is yes, but this is also an ongoing research area. Can we actually divide the image? Maybe yes. Can we actually divide the music? Maybe yes. So this ongoing research is actually generalize our decision tree method to other modalities of the data, like the tensor, the image, and eventually all kinds of data. And we ask this question, whether the decision tree itself could handle the multimodality of the data. So here in our recent research, working with our colleagues, we're trying to apply this decision tree method to the functional MRI data to actually diagnose and detect the Alzheimer's disease from their fMRI scans. We can actually separate the fMRI scans into several regions and identify those regions that has higher potentiality of getting the disease biological markers. So this is the second thrust. And then this is an interesting one. So not only fMRI data, we also extended the decision tree methods to the tensors. What is tensors? Tensors, we watch YouTube every day. Oh, okay, probably not every day. So the image is a two-dimensional array, right? If we stack the image together, we have a third dimension, that is a time, right? So that is a three-dimensional tensor because it can go three different directions. So by extending the decision tree into this tensor-like data, we can actually separate the signals of the tensors. For example, this is a mixed signal of these three types of the frames. And then using the decision tree, we can actually come up with some conclusion saying that, okay, from this second to this second, we can actually separate the first class and the second class and the third class. This is also just like building a histogram along the time axis, right? Okay, this is the last one. So partition is good, but sometimes the partition may introduce additional bias because you will take it for granted that within a partition, everybody is the same because they are close together. But even that, everybody is not the same. So remember, previously, we kind of make the sum of the children's variance as small as possible, right? So now we change our splitting criterion by saying that we're making the maximum variance of the left and right children as small as possible. we're taking care of the worst variants instead of the overall variance. And why are we wanting to do that? And here is a concrete motivation. If we have such a high frequency data, so here is a EEG data, and then we're trying to fit it using a decision tree, then if we use the sum criterion, then the split will actually concentrate at the boundary, because at the boundary, the oscillation as well as the variance are pretty big. But if we actually take care of this maximum of the children's, you can see the split is actually fitting the signals pretty well by actually spreading the risk across the whole horizon. Okay, so this is our paper. I'll leave the technical details for homework. So here is another example, and we're moving to the second half of our title of today's presentation, in the AI era. So decision tree is a very classic model people started back in 50s, 80s, and 2000-ish. So like such a classic model that were interpretable, how can such a model be used in the AI era? So let's consider back to this image applications. We can actually learn a partition that has a semantic meanings for this image. This is an astronaut image, so you can see that the partition learned by a decision tree by maximizing their contrast is shown here using this red lines. We can actually see that the partition induced by such a decision tree will actually have very clear semantic meaning. What does that mean? So for example, this partition is for the astronaut's hat, and this partition is for the rocket. So we can actually change the splitting criterion to focus on such a detail so that the learned tree will induce the partition that has the semantic meaning. Semantic meaning will actually give us a better representation of the underlying image that help us to get a better representation of this image. Getting such a better representation of the image, we can actually have a more explainable generative AI. So for example, I'll probably focus all my diffusion for the astronaut's hat because there are more details. And I'll probably focus a little bit less on the partition that consists of the background of the image because it's, well, very low resolution. And also, like talking about LLMs, we can actually organize our language, or in other words, the prompt that we give the LLM into a tree, because our sentence has their intrinsic grammars, right? So instead of inputting a string, we'll actually consider such a prompt as a collection of the trees that were organized well together. So this is also some ongoing research. And then we also want to understand the LLM reasoning and self-distillation, as we mentioned in earlier slides, how to do that through the trees. These are all very exciting research that we're all motivated by, hey, we really want to understand this state-of-art AI model, what they are doing, can we understanding it, okay? But every talk has a bummer, so we have to put up this slide because of the interpretability. So this is a multi-year research run by Microsoft Research, saying that sometimes contradictory, if people were given a very interpretable model, they are just going to trust it so much. They're just trusting so much, so they're actually ignoring the errors made by this white box or interpretable models. So that's another things we really want to look into. For example, a clean model like the decision tree will sometimes predict a vehicle speed faster than light, which is clearly physically impossible in our universe. So this actually inspired another direction of research, physical informed models that actually put the physical laws like Newton's laws, like the Hooke's laws into our model to make sure that our parameter estimation is guaranteed and consistent of all the reality. Another danger is that a clean model may lead to unverifiable decisions For example, it will probably suggest to take a super expensive treatment for a single patient. So in that, we are actually have another concept of suboptimality, or if we have the cost and treatment trade-off, we can also have the Pareto optimality with additional target. So this is the curse of interpretability. When you look at super simple model, don't be fooled by it. Even if it gives you some decision, think twice, okay? So to summing up today's presentation, so the trees and the decision trees are minimal interpretable models that can adapt symbolic regression, multimodality input, and handle the high frequency data in our recent research thrust. And in the AI era, we should consider using the trees to help us to make decisions when the black box AI models lack the clarity we need. But at a grander topic of today, like the interpretability research is really a joint effort across different disciplines, across the campus and a wider community beyond statistics, beyond engineering and STEM. We need to talk to people to see how different discipline researchers actually have different understanding of the interpretability, although we can have some formal definition, but really like people from different backgrounds will treat the interpretability very differently. So my current thought is that although our research will allow us to understanding the model better, but collaboration will actually establish the standard, what is the well accepted standard for this interpretability. And finally, tying back to Erin's presentation, that only education will deepen our understanding. Like without education, like it will be only agreement within the academia what is interpretability. Like nowadays, everyone can get access to the large language model and the generative AI very easily. So it's really through the education that we can like broadcast this very important concept of interpretability of the model. And so I think the STAT and STAT community, D2K, is ready to embrace this wider community, and let's grow a tree together. Okay, so I'll stop here.